Mm.
All right. Greetings, everyone, wherever you may be. My name is. I'll be doing this presentation on the topic importance of biodiversity and conservation. So essentially, this presentation focuses on what biodiversity is, what conservation is, and what are the importance, the relevance of them to the environment and then to the human society as well. So basically, that's the essence of my presentation. So this presentation will cover the definition of biodiversity. We'll talk about the types of biodiversity, the importance, why we need to conserve the biodiversity, and what biodiversity is in the first place. We'll look at the objectives of biodiversity, importance of it, problems of biodiversity loss, and then we'll conclude it there. So first off, what is biodiversity? Biodiversity encompasses the variety among living organisms from all sources. That is from all ecosystems, from the marine ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems. That is, we have living organisms and the interaction between them and the environment. So before we get a clearer understanding of what biodiversity is, I think we need to look at the components that make up biodiversity. We are looking at the species, we are looking at the ecosystems before we come to the biodiversity itself. I will explain that in a bit. We need to understand that biodiversity has to do with the living things and the interactions with the environment and the connections between these particular different interactions that exist in the environment. So biodiversity involves life on Earth, and this includes organisms, all living organisms and the ecosystems they inhabit. It centers on the interaction between living organisms, as I explained earlier, that is plants, animals, and microorganisms, and the ecosystems that they form. So when we talk about biodiversity, it is a summation of all of these interactions, microorganisms, the higher animals, and then the plants in the environment, how they interact with each other, and then the effect or impact of these interactions between these living organisms as well as their environment. So what are the types of biodiversity that we have? Essentially, biodiversity exists in three main sectors. We are looking at the species level, we are looking at the ecosystem level, and then the biodiversity itself. So, sorry, the genetic level. So, at the genetic level, it refers to the variety of genes within a species, allowing for adaptation and evolution. For instance, we could have a monkey species, we could have a plant species. What is the diversity within them? What is the variation within this particular species? And how does this variation enable them to adapt to the environment and cope within the environment? Now, I think I need to explain that it is important to know that the higher the variation within the species, the stronger the species are. For instance, in the human species, we have basically um, for instance, we are all of the same species. We have black people, we have white people, we have Asians, we have Latinos, and all of that. There are some slight differences between us. For instance, black people have a lot of melanin, white people do not have that. So when there is an interaction between these particular individuals in terms of reproduction and otherwise, it is expected that, for instance, a hybrid between a white person and a black person should at least help them cope well within the environment. So these are the kind of variations that we are talking about. Then we have species biodiversity, looking at the different species of the same organism that exist. For instance, I will go back to the monkey species, for example, when we consider the different types of monkeys that we have, the long-tailed monkey, the short-tailed monkey, how do the interactions between these organisms improve their survivability, right? So it is important to understand this, that there is also a differences in this particular species as well. Then we have ecosystem biodiversity. We are looking at the way living things interact with the environment. How do plants interact with the environment? How do animals interact with the environment? How do plants and animals interact with each other? And how do they also interact with the environment? That is the ecosystem. And how do these different ecosystems also interact with each other? So the interaction between them also forms a different biodiversity of its own. And it's also important to understand that these interactions, in a way, either improves the survivability of any biodiversity or ecosystem, or it actually makes it more vulnerable. Now, going back to the species, I think it's important to highlight this. We have in every ecosystem, we have what we call keystone species, organisms that are essential for the survival of the particular ecosystem. For instance, lower plants, like let's assume in a savanna ecosystem, you have grasses. Now, these grasses are important. They survive and ensure that other living organisms like animals and all those higher species also survive. If all the grass dies, definitely the animals that rely on them also will die. So these particular species that are very, very important in an ecosystem are referred to as keystone species. Now, this particular combination of the species, the ecosystem, and the genetic diversity makes an ecosystem, a biodiversity very resilient. Sorry, I'm trying to move to the next slide. All right. So let us look at the importance of biodiversity. What are the importance of plants, the animals, the water systems, the forest, even the desert? What are the importance of them to human beings? How do we benefit from them? What are the importance of them to even other organisms? What are the importance of them to the environment in general? So there are several important things that we derive from biodiversity. And they are what we mostly term as ecosystem services, right? What are the services that these living things provide to human beings in general and the environment? So we are looking at biodiversity maintains ecosystem balance, right? Biodiversity plays a crucial role in maintaining the balance of ecosystems by ensuring the survival of different species and their interactions. So as I said earlier on, the higher the biodiversity, the more likely the survivability of the living organisms there, because they are less vulnerable to the environmental factors like drought, flood, and the rest. So if there is a higher biodiversity, assuming that there's a forest fire, the grasses are resilient. They're able to grow back, and then the animals that depend on them are also able to get food to eat. And then those that are predators on those animals also get to consume them. So in essence, it causes the living organisms to survive instead of them becoming extinct or dying out. So we have that importance of playing ecosystem balance. We also have providing ecosystem services. So biodiversity contributes to the provision of various ecosystem services, such as clean air, water, nutrient cycling, and climate regulation. I think I will spend time to explain this. When we talk about clean air, we all know the importance of plants to the environment. We know that plants absorbs carbon dioxide and then releases oxygen at different time periods within the 24-hour day. So if there are more plants within the environment, they absorb more carbon dioxide, and so in a sense, purifies the air of carbon dioxide and make it safe for human breathing and other animals that depend on the air. And then also we have the water system, for instance, rivers, streams, even the oceans. We depend on the oceans, I mean, for meat, fish, and all of that. We also depend on fresh water for drinking in some areas of the world. And then we also have nutrient cycling. That is recycling the nutrient back into the soil, right? For instance, when a plant dies and it falls off, the microorganisms within the soil decompose these plants parts. And then what happens is that the nutrient that is stored in the plants is released back into the soil, right? So in a way, it is recycling the nutrients back into the soil and preventing the soil from losing the valuable nutrient that they need. Mind you, the nutrient that is in the plants was already gotten from the soil. So if the plant falls back onto the soil and the soil decomposes and the nutrients go back into the soil, in a way it has recycled the nutrient back into the soil. And then we also have climate regulation, as I indicated earlier on with the case of plants, which absorbs carbon dioxide. So we know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So if it is absorbed from the atmosphere, it reduces the potential of global warming within the Earth systems. So biodiversity, in a sense, is important in regulating climate change. It also supports human well-being. So biodiversity is essential for human well-being as it provides food, medicine, and recreational opportunities. In my part of the world, that is in Africa, a lot of people depend on the forest for meat, also for certain food types, as well as medicine from some plants. So the forests play important roles in the survivability of the people who depends on them in terms of the medicine and also as recreational opportunities. In some places of the world, we have what we call canopy walks. It's essentially a long rope or sort of like a staircase that connects different trees. So people walk on them as a way of recreation, just to take them off their normal busy day work schedules, just to refreshing up, right? And the ecosystems provide these particular services. Others also go on a hike. Others also go just touring the forest and seeing the wildlife and all of that. So it provides recreational opportunities and support for even economies, countries that have these stars. For instance, when you go to the national parks in Kenya, where people go to the field to see rhinos, the zebras, the lions, and the rest. The people who allow them, the forest guards who allow them entry into these places, take money from them. So it also supports national economies. And then also we have resilience and adaptability. So diverse ecosystems are more resilient to disturbances. I think I explained this earlier on when I was making mention of the different types of biodiversity. So with a wide array of species, there is a higher chance that some organisms will survive and adapt to changes, ensuring the ecosystem survival. Let me put it this way. We know that lions feed on their prey, such as antelopes, zebras, wildebeest, and the rest. So assuming that the antelopes and the wildebeest and the zebras and all that the lions depend on go extinct, assuming that they all die, right? What would the lions feed on? It means that they also have to go extinct. They have to die one way or the other. So that is the importance of having keystone species within the ecosystem. I explained it earlier on. And then also, for instance, in the face of climate change, diverse ecosystems may contain species that are better suited to withstand altered conditions. Yes, indeed. And those species ensure that there is resilience in the ecosystem. That means that should in case there is a shock within the ecosystem, like forest fire, there is flooding, there is drought, these particular resilient species are able to ensure that the resilience, the survivability of other organisms that depend on them is not destroyed, and that they're able to regrow or regenerate so that those that feed on them will still have a source of survival for themselves. Nutrient cycling, I think I explained this earlier on in the previous slide. And then the genetic diversity within species. Genetic diversity is vital for adaptation and resilience. So a diverse gene pool allows species to evolve and respond to environmental changes, such as diseases or shifts in climate patterns. I think I explained this earlier also, where when we have different diversity, genetic diversity within a species, some are able to adapt more, some are able to adapt less. So when there is a sort of genetic interaction between these particular individuals within a species, the outcomes of these particular interactions are more resilient than the parents themselves. And I think this is even being replicated in human environments where they are combining, for instance, corn species that are less adaptable to the environment with those that are more adaptable to the environment to ensure that when they grow it in particular areas, they're able to survive. Initially, they wouldn't be able to survive there. So when we have a wider array of diversity within the genes of a species, there is a high possibility of survivability. And that also enables them to cope to certain environmental factors like climate change, and also helps them cope with disease outbreaks and the rest. So we continue with the importance of biodiversity. We have food security and medicinal resources. I made mention of the medicine, food security, as I stated earlier on. When we go to Latin America, when we come to Africa, some parts in Asia, where we depend on the forest for food. For instance, for meat, also for some plants that they consider food. That is where the importance of the forest as a food source comes into play. It ensures that the people who depends on this particular forest are able to get food to eat and so are nourished and do not fall sick or contract disease or even die out from hunger. So when a biodiversity is resilient, it is able to provide these particular services to the people who needs them. In previous years, a couple of decades back, especially in Africa, where the advent of technology wasn't very high, and then people depended on what we call plant-based medicine, right? People used to go into the forest, cut down some plant trees, leaves, bring it home, come and boil it, combine them, boil it, and then drink them to treat diseases like malaria, typhoid, and other forms of fever, and then infections as well. Prior to modern technology that's introduced modern medicine into the African continent, this was what people were relying on to cure their diseases. So in a sense, the forest biodiversity played important role in providing medicinal resources for the people who actually relied on them. So it also plays important role in disease regulation, as explained by the previous section, that when it provides medicine, obviously, it also reduces the impact of disease or disease outbreak. So biodiversity can regulate the prevalence of diseases. For instance, diverse ecosystems often have a balance of species that can act as natural predators for competitors, for disease-carrying organisms, helping to control their populations and reducing disease transmission. Let me give a typical example of the Ebola outbreak that occurred somewhere in West Africa a couple of years back in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and the rest. These, from the studies that were shown, that these were actually transmitted by some bat species and then some species of rodents, which carry them within their body systems. Now, these particular rodents and bat species were prey to certain higher animals like the lions, the tigers, the jaguars, and the foxes, and the rest. So if these predators feed on the prey, what is the probability that human beings will consume such bat species or such rodent species and then contract the Ebola disease into themselves? So in essence, the higher animals are actually preventing or regulating the outbreak of diseases. So we also have clean air and water. So biodiverse ecosystems, particularly forest and wetland, play a vital role in purifying air and water. Different plant species help in the filtration and absorption of pollutants, improving air quality, and ensuring clean water sources. What does this mean? In some places, wetlands are used as natural wastewater treatment systems, where the waste is channeled into the wetlands and they are stored there because of the plant microorganisms and atmosphere interactions. They are able to biodegrade this waste substance like feces or even wastewater from factories. So they are able to biodegrade them and make them useless, harmless to humans and the environment. So these are important roles that they play in terms of waste and all of that. We also have clean air. I stated earlier on the importance of plants in absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We also have the oceans, which is the largest sink for absorbing carbon dioxide and the rest, right? So these are very important roles that biodiversity and ecosystems play in ensuring that we have clean air and water, in ensuring that disease is regulated, in ensuring that people have food and other medicinal resources to take care of themselves in the case of disease outbreaks. And then we also have cultural and then recreational values. These are sort of merged. I explained earlier on in the cultural sense. For instance, in Africa, if you've ever encountered African movies, they tell you evil forest, where the ancestors were buried and then there are some evil spirits there. So sometimes these forest forms an integral aspect of their culture. They identify with this particular cultural setup. In some places, they tell you we don't eat fish from this particular river, right? In a way, they are trying to conserve the biodiversity within that particular water resources. So they sort of frame a taboo around it that people cannot consume meat from this particular river. Some say we cannot consume this particular type of animal like rodents. We don't eat zebras and the rest. They are trying to conserve that particular species. And so they sort of shroud it within, they shroud their culture around it to prevent people from consuming those plants or animal species in a way that will make them extinct. So in some places of the world, ecosystem and biodiversity forms integral components of people's culture. Some people derive spiritual essence from trees as well. Some trees, they believe that some trees are fetish and they tend to worship them. They also believe that some animals are fetish. For instance, when you go to places like India, people worship snakes, right? So they form important components of their culture. They worship them. And in so doing, they don't kill the snakes. In a way, the snake population is also conserved and prevented from being harmed by human influences, right? Or others also derive inspirations from these natural landscapes. Yeah, and then health and well-being, green spaces, diverse landscapes, and natural habitats contribute significantly to human health and well-being. When you consider a perfect scenario like the Central Park in New York, in the United States, where we have a huge green space made up of forests and other living organisms that are being conserved by the laws of the state. People go there to, get inspiration. People go there to relax. People go there to get in touch with nature and all of that. So in essence, they go there to breathe clean air sometimes. So in essence, this serves as a way of improving health and well-being. Others go there for jogging in the morning, biking, and the rest. So this also contributes to their well-being. We have economic opportunities. I think I explained this earlier on, but to add up to it, biodiversity fuels economics through ecotourism, recreation, and various industries reliant on natural resources. Natural landscapes, diverse ecosystems, and wildlife attract tourists. And in Africa, this is very, 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 very prominent, especially in Eastern and Central and Southern Africa, where we have the natural parks, the national parks. You have the Kruger National Parks, the Nairobi National Parks, and all of that. People go there to see lions, see zebras, see rhinos, and the rest. The people go there pay to go and have a feel of these animals in their natural environment instead of seeing them in the zoo somewhere in New York or in London or maybe Buenos Aires or sort of thing. They go to the national parks to view the animals in their real environment. And so because of that, the people who allow them generate income from them and so contributes to their national economies, what is called ecotourism. All right, so let's look at biodiversity conservation. We've looked at what biodiversity is, what the importance of biodiversity are. Let's look at biodiversity conservation, and I think the name is self-explanatory. Biodiversity conservation is essentially protecting and preserving the wealth and variety of species, habitat, ecosystem, and genetic diversity on the planet. Yeah, so when we talk about biodiversity conservation, we are looking at protecting species, protecting ecosystems, protecting living organisms, protecting landscapes against negative human influence. We can all attest to the negative influence of humans on the Amazon forest, which is the largest rainforest in the world. Encroachment on it for trees, mining, and all of that has significantly impacted the biodiversity within that particular catchment. And in Africa, especially in West Africa, we face that problem very well when we have people mining forest resources. So it is very, very important that we conserve biodiversity. And it is an integral part of sustainable development because future generations will depend on the environment for survival. If we, the current generation, do not conserve the biodiversity that is existing now, what are we going to leave for future generations? So what are the objectives of biodiversity conservation? In other words, what are the importance of it? Why should we conserve biodiversity? Why should we protect biodiversity? Why should we protect living organisms? Why should we protect the plants and the rest? So one of the primary objectives is to prevent the extinction of species. That's preserving species diversity. I think if you've ever done a bit of history and then paleontology and all of that, you realize that There used to be a time in human history where we had mammoth existing. Now they've all been extinct. What happened? There are several reasons for that. One of them is human hunting these organisms at an uncontrollable rate, causing them all to die, and other environmental factors, right? So it is important that we conserve the biodiversity to preserve the species that we have now. So conservation efforts focus on safeguarding populations of endangered and threatened species by protecting their habitat, reducing threat, and implementing breeding and reintroduction programs to bolster their numbers. Sometimes we could have some species that already existed in a particular landscape or ecosystem, and because of human influence, they all got extinct. So if they are the same species in different parts of the world, they go and bring them and reintroduce them into that particular environment where they used to be. Sometimes there used to be a higher population of a particular species due to human influence and encroachment. Their population drastically reduced. So what happened? Governments and authorities have to go and search for the species from different environments and then re-add them up to what already exists to also, in a sense, increase their population. So it is important to conserve biodiversity so that we can preserve the species diversity that we have. And the image right next to this particular words, it just contains the different species of bugs that we have. And bugs play an important role in the environment. Some of them degrade trees, leaves. Some of them also feed on other microorganisms and other, tiny ants and the rest. So they play important role in nutrient recycling. If they decompose these trees, and animals that are dead already, they decompose them. So if, should in case we lose this particular species of bugs or this population of bugs in the environment, which organism is going to decompose the plants that have fallen on the ground, and how would the nutrient be cycled back into the soil? So this tells you the importance of these organisms within the environment and why it is important for us to conserve them. Let us look at maintaining genetic diversity as well. So conserving genetic diversity within species is crucial for the adaptation and survival in changing environment. Our environment is changing day in and day out. Every year we have new things coming up. We have increased heat waves, we have increasing drought, we have increasing flooding events, right? So if these shocks, environmental shocks, hit ecosystems and hit the biodiversity within those ecosystems, how are they able to adapt? How are they able to survive? They are able to do this if there is a higher variety within the genetic makeup of these species, individuals within the particular species. When the variety is high, there's a higher probability that they can survive and become more resilient. So conserving biodiversity ensures that there's maintenance of genetic diversity within a particular species and within even an ecosystem as a whole. So preserving diverse gene pools ensure that species have the genetic variability needed to evolve and respond to environmental changes, diseases, and other challenges. And then also protecting ecosystems and habitats. Yes, conservation aims to preserve and restore natural habitats and ecosystems. And yes, indeed, as I explained earlier on, if you have keystone species within an environment, within an ecosystem, and you don't conserve them, you don't protect them, you leave them to the elements, you leave them to human influence, and they go extinct, put in mind that it also affects the other organisms that depend on them. So by protecting this particular keystone species and even all organisms within the ecosystem, we ensure that there's preservation and restoration of natural habitat and ecosystems as well. Yes. And then also healthy and diverse ecosystems are essential for the survival of numerous species and the functioning of ecological processes. So this involves protecting areas such as forests, wetlands, coral reefs, grasslands, and other vital habitats. We also have sustainable use of natural resources. If you conserve biodiversity, I explained this earlier on. If you conserve plant species, if you conserve animal species, if you protect the landscape. We leave a sort of heritage for future generations, for posterity to come, something that they can depend on also for their survival, and they wouldn't have to struggle to find means of protecting the environment left behind by their forefathers. Also, mitigating human-induced threat. Yeah, so if we conserve biodiversity in a way, we are also preventing human threat. So it goes in two ways: ensuring that the species, the ecosystems are resilient, and at the same way, preventing human influence. So when we are able to do this in an effective way, we mitigate human-induced threat, like the release of toxins into the environment, um, indiscriminate lumbering, and all of that. So these things, in essence, protect biodiversity against the threat of human destruction and pollution. Yeah. It also promotes awareness and education, right? If we are conserving the ecosystems, it is an integral part of it is through education. Somebody might in Africa somewhere, in Asia somewhere, in Latin America somewhere, may not know that if you go and hunt monkeys every day, there's a high possibility that they will all die out within the next 10 years. The person may not know and might assume that because the forest is big, there are so many of the monkeys in the forest. So an integral part of it is through education, right? So educating the people on the importance or objectives of biodiversity conservation. So international cooperation and policy development. I think that, for instance, I made mention of the Amazon forest and efforts to protect this forest and the environment is sometimes concerted. It is not one country, it is not one organization. It's a consortium of different organizations, sometimes multinational organizations that come together. So in such a way, it fosters cooperation and collaboration within these organizations and countries as well. Now, some ecosystems are transboundary. For instance, when we consider the Amazon forest, it extends beyond Brazil to some parts of Peru and the rest. So efforts to protect them needs collaboration between these different countries. So in conserving biodiversity, it promotes international cooperation and policy development also. Now, we also look at the importance of biodiversity conservation. I think they are very similar to what I explained earlier on: ecosystem stability and resilience, ecosystem services, medicinal resources, food security, culture and aesthetic values, and then climate change mitigation, economic opportunities, genetic diversity and adaptation, and then problems of biodiversity loss. I think that's the final section under this particular presentation. I intentionally placed this particular article here from the London School of Economics. And it says, what are the extent and causes of biodiversity loss? And here it says, what is the current state of biodiversity? And I would like to read this particular highlighted point at the bottom below. It says, the Worldwide Fund for Nature's Living Planet report of 2022 document a 69% average loss in the abundance of mammal, bird, reptile, fish, and amphibian species since 1970. So the population of vertebrates living in freshwater ecosystems have declined even more by 83% on average over the same period. So if you are somebody who loves nature and hopes that in the coming generation also have something to rely on for inspiration, for medicine, for recreation, and the rest, this information should shock you, considering the fact that 1970 is just about 5 decades ago, and we've lost over 69% of the abundance of mammals, birds, reptile, fish, and amphibian species. This is a huge problem. So if for the past 5 decades, we've lost 69%, what will happen in the next century? What will happen in the next 7 decades? So this also feeds into the importance of biodiversity conservation, why we should conserve ecosystems, why we should conserve species, why we should conserve, we should preserve genes within species. Because if concerted and effective measures are not taken now, the effects might be very dire in the near future. So some of the main problems of biodiversity loss, we have loss of habitat for wildlife, negative impact on human health, coastal pollution, ocean acidification, exacerbation of climate change impact, financial loss in remediation of destroyed ecosystems. And the image here tells, oh, coastal pollution, sometimes pipes from factories are channeled into the ocean. In some places of the world, human fecal matter is dumped into the oceans. Some of these things contains materials that decompose in the ocean to emit methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, which are heavy greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. So it is important that we come up with efforts to prevent such activities. We also have habitat loss for wildlife, human urbanization, human settlement. People are now encroaching on previously considered natural environment, forest environment. They are now encroaching on them to build. They are now encroaching on them to mine for minerals. They are now encroaching on them to set up factories to build roads and the rest, and schools and stuff. So the living organism, the animals that relies on this particular plant and soil environment are also moving further and further away. And the smaller the habitat or the ecosystem becomes, the higher probability that the living things depending on them become very vulnerable. So it is important that we conserve these things. Ocean acidification, dumping this fecal matter, waste from, what do you call it? Factories, even plastic waste and the rest, into the oceans, sometimes decomposes. The microorganisms in the ocean decomposes this particular, what do you call it? Waste materials. In a way, it absorbs the oxygen within the water bodies. And this also leads to acidification because the pH increases and all of that. So it is important that we stop these particular activities from being and particular waste from being released into the ocean environment. So I'll leave you with this, and I'll leave you with a quote from E.O. Wilson, which is one of my mentors in biodiversity. He said, look closely at nature. Every species is a masterpiece, exquisitely adapted to the particular environment in which it has survived. Who are we to destroy or even diminish biodiversity? Those that are evolutionists say that it takes millions of years for, and sometimes billions of years for some animals to adapt to become what they are today. So if it takes millions and billions and thousands of years for ecosystems to form that, and we are using just 50 years to destroy it, it is not sustainable. We all need to put our hands together and ensure that whatever we have in our environment, in our ecosystems, in our forests, in our water bodies, in our oceans, in our rivers are actually preserved to safeguard the survivability of our future. Thank you. All right, Martina, are you there? All right. Hello, Martina, can you hear me? Can I go ahead? Okay. I guess I'll proceed with the presentation. So this is Unit 3, Introduction to Climate Change Mitigation. My name is Paul Dankwa, and I'm with e-Biome, and this particular topic is quite important, especially in our world today, where everywhere we find ourselves, there are some particular activities, human activities, that is contributing to climate change. So it is important for us to understand how we can mitigate that in our own simple way. How can we mitigate climate change? What is climate change mitigation? What are the key industry sectors that are contributing to climate change mitigation? So that's the essence of this particular presentation. So someone may ask, what is climate change mitigation? And I'm sure we've all heard of climate change before. At least if you are not a professional in that particular sector, you've at least heard it one way or the other. Now, climate change is the change in the climate patterns, and we know that climate is the average weather condition at a particular place over a long period of time. Sometimes they say 30 to 35 years. That is what the climate is. So when we talk about climate change, obviously it means that the changing in the average weather patterns within a particular place over a long period of time. Now, what is climate change mitigation? As the name states, mitigation has to do with preventing or reducing, right? So climate change mitigation, reducing the flow of heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, that is the greenhouse gases, right? It encompasses reducing greenhouse gases from main sources such as power plants, factories, cars, and farms. And this is according to the European Environment Agency. And then the Global Environment Facility, GEF, also explains climate change mitigation as reducing the net release of greenhouse gases emissions that are warming our planet into the atmosphere. And then the UNFCCC also explains that efforts to reduce emissions and enhance sinks. So essentially, what these three definitions are saying is that climate change mitigation is simply efforts to prevent the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and then at the same time produce or generate more sinks that are able to absorb these greenhouse gases from being released into the atmosphere. So when we talk about climate change mitigation, we are looking at two things here. One, preventing the emission of greenhouse gases, and then two, increasing sinks. These things could be forest, plants, and oceans, and there are more, what do you call it, technologies that are being developed. I'll speak about that as we progress through this particular presentation. So what are the significance of climate change mitigation? What is the importance? In essence, when we say climate change mitigation, what exactly are we trying to achieve? So climate change mitigation is crucial to avoid the most severe impact of climate change, such as extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and disruptions to ecosystems and economies. So promoting climate change mitigation approaches will ensure a sustainable and habitable future for generations to come. And as I was explaining earlier on, we know that global warming, a key contributing factor to global warming is greenhouse gases. These greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, chlorofluorocarbons, and the rest. These are mostly generated through human activities. So climate mitigation essentially is trying to prevent the activities that release these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, whilst at the same time trying to set up mechanisms and schemes that will absorb the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So let's move sharp to climate change mitigation approaches. Let us consider low carbon development industries. Now let's look at low carbon development. What is low carbon development? So low carbon development is a new pattern of development that aims to reduce carbon dioxide emissions as much as possible while not affecting increase of economic warfare at the same time. So what is essentially saying is that it is a development that prevents the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in a way that economic activities are not hampered or are not impeded. For example, let me give you one typical example, electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are used for transport. mostly it could be used for carpooling or even personalized transportation. Assuming that you're a taxi driver who used to use a vehicle that depends on fossil fuel for transporting your passengers. Now you're using an electric vehicle, let's say a Tesla Model S, as your taxi cab. You are now using a machine that is not dependent on fossil fuel. And at the same time, your job as a taxi driver is not taken away from you because you still take passengers to wherever they want to go, and then you take your money back. So in a way, you realize that it has reduced carbon dioxide emissions, but your economic activities are not affected. This is at the individual level. We could also look at it at the national level, where, for instance, people set up windmills, solar PV cells, instead of depending on fossil fuel powered um, and electricity generation plants. So in a way, you realize that um, the carbon dioxide and the nitrous oxide and the rest that are released into the atmosphere is prevented. And at the same time, the electricity generation is also being done. So we are not stopping the economic activity, but you are rather what? Reducing the carbon dioxide emissions. So the aim of low carbon development is to reduce carbon emissions while promoting economic growth and development. So you also say that the approach is to use technology that has low carbon emissions. And I explained this earlier on. So yeah, so promoting economic growth and then development. And I think I should emphasize that this is still a development. That's why it says low carbon development. So there are new technologies, new frameworks, new systems, new infrastructures that are being set up yearly, year on after year to add up to this. So the possibilities are endless, but there are some that are already existing. And I think I'll share more details into it in this particular presentation. So what are the low carbon development strategies? Here, we are considering strategies. We'll come back to technologies, but let's look at the strategies. So there are 5 classes of low carbon technologies, and we have carbon reduction technologies, we have carbon-free technologies, carbon removal technologies, carbon management technologies, resource conservation and recycling technologies. I'll explain each and every one of it in a bit. So what are carbon reduction technologies? As the first one, the carbon reduction technologies. So carbon reduction technologies encompass a broad range of methods and innovations aimed at reducing or capturing carbon dioxide emissions from various sources. These technologies play a crucial role in mitigating climate change by reducing the amount of CO2 released in the environment, right? So it's essentially reducing or capturing carbon dioxide emissions from various sources. Examples of these are energy-saving home appliances, enhancing weathering, that's exposing or living minerals to air and water, and then direct air capture technologies. So per the definition, it says that reducing or capturing carbon dioxide. So energy-saving home appliances, what do you call it, reduces carbon emissions. And then also, in a sense, for instance, if the appliance demands lesser electricity, the station that is generating the electricity also, if it is a fossil fuel powered plant, it doesn't have to also put in more fuel to generate more electricity, which will also consequently release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So enhancing weathering activities. So exposing or living minerals to air and water. And what this does is that it absorbs the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere also. And then we have direct air capture technology. What direct air capture technology does is that it works in the same way as the human lungs works. What it does is that it absorbs air from the atmosphere and then it traps the carbon dioxide in it and then release the fresh air into the environment. When I say fresh air that's been cleansed of carbon dioxide. In some of the direct air capture technologies, it's also when the air is absorbed into the system, it's also channeled to a turbine, which flows over the turbine and causes the turbine to generate electricity. So it's a two-way system, capturing the carbon dioxide whilst generating clean energy from the air. So carbon-free technologies. as the second one, we have carbon reduction technologies, carbon-free technologies. So carbon-free technologies are those that do not produce carbon dioxide emissions during their operation. They encompass a variety of approaches across different sectors to achieve energy production, transportation, and industrial processes without relying on fossil fuels. And we know that the transport sector is the biggest emitter of one of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide into the environment. So carbon-free technologies ensures that these activities, human activities, go on without the emission of carbon dioxide, right? And these are very essential in energy production. This is where they've gotten a lot of foothold in it: energy production, transportation sector, industrial processes sector, right? Some of these are nuclear energy, solar energy, wind energy. I will do presentations on these particular things in a different presentation, key industries for low carbon development, right? So nuclear energy, in essence, in the processes itself, does not release much carbon dioxide. Solar energy, in terms of producing the solar PV cells and the others, release some sort of carbon dioxide, but in its operational stage, there is limited carbon dioxide from its operations. The same thing with wind energy. Carbon removal technologies. So carbon removal technology is also known as carbon dioxide removal. And this is also sort of new technology that is gaining foothold in the climate space. So it is also known as negative emissions technology. So they are designed to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. These technologies are crucial in addressing climate change by actively reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases already present in the atmosphere. We all know of afforestation and reforestation, and then biochar sequestration. So these are all technologies that are being used to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In my opinion, what I think is that this is more of a slow process in capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, because some plants that are able to absorb significant amounts of or extract significant amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it takes longer to grow. So it makes the sequestration process longer. So let's look at carbon management and resource conservation, that is risk and recycling technologies. So this involves the sum of equipment, methods, knowledge, and other modalities in climate mitigation. This also includes policies and the rest. So resource conservation and recycling belongs to low carbon technologies because the recycling of waste products prevent them being released into the environment, and thus reduce the buildup of carbon dioxide and methane. So in actual sense, we are sort of employing a circular economic concept to waste management in this sense. So for instance, if the plastic waste, if the textile waste, if the organic waste are prevented from being dumped onto the landfills. Mind you, when these particular wastes are dumped onto the landfills, their interaction between them and then microorganisms decomposing them in oxygen-deprived environments, in anaerobic conditions, causes them to release methane, which has a higher greenhouse effect than even carbon dioxide itself. So preventing these things from being dumped into the atmosphere also ensures that carbon dioxide is mitigated from release into the atmosphere. So let's look at global strategic frameworks for climate change mitigation. Let's consider climate change mitigation from a global level, right? What are the global frameworks, global structures, institutions in place to ensure that climate change mitigation is well implemented across the globe, right? So the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contribution. We all know what the Paris Agreement is and what the stipulations in them are. And one of the key outcomes of the Paris Agreement and further updates of it is the nationally determined contributions, NDCs. So NDCs are countries' commitment to reducing carbon dioxide emissions, so nationally determined contributions. So it is a concerted effort by every government, every state, to prove that they are putting measures in place, and the measures are actually listed in the NDC document. These particular measures are to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, or even in sometimes, in a sense, increase human adaptation to climate change. So NDCs are commitments made by each country to reduce national emissions and adapt to climate change impact. The agreement mandates each country to communicate, maintain, and update their NDCs regularly. What I've attached to the right of this slide is the nationally determined contribution, the updated one from the Republic of Ghana, and it was released by the government of Ghana, submitted to the UNFCCC. So this particular document outlines the country's measures to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and ensure that its citizens are able to adapt to climate change. Now, these documents are communicated to different countries because sometimes efforts to mitigate climate change needs transnational collaborations. So it is important that this particular document and the project are communicated to other state agencies and other international bodies who can also liaise with other governments to see how best collaboration efforts can actually enhance this mitigation activities. Now, these NDCs are updated regularly, sometimes on a 5-year period. I think that's the period, yes, 5-year period. Every country has to update it and then submit the updated version. If it is not updated, a new one has to be made to be submitted to the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is a screenshot from the Ghana's NDCs, just to show what some measures that the country have put in place. And looking at it from here, it says Ghana has developed 19 policy actions in 10 priority areas to achieve nationally determined contribution goals in the next decade. So the 19 policies stated here, actions translate into 13 adaptations and 34 mitigation programs of actions, refers to as measures. So some of these long-term outcomes are to accelerate sustainable energy transition, that is incorporating more solar PV cells, wind energy into the national grid instead of depending solely on the dams and then the fossil fuel generated power, electricity generation power plants. So build resilient economies and risk societies, enhance early warning and disaster risk management systems. So this has to do with Internet of Things, satellite technology and data processing and all of that. Enhance landscape restoration, ensure responsible production and consumption, foster social inclusion, that is focusing on youth and women, and then provide smart and then safe communities within the country, especially for vulnerable population within the communities like women, children, and especially girls. So policy frameworks for climate change mitigation. So these are also in a way national and international measures. So we have carbon pricing. So carbon pricing is a market-based mechanism aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions by putting a price on carbon emissions. In Ghana, when you come to the national economy, we have the emissions levy. Everybody is paying taxes for carbon dioxide emissions. Whether you emit or you don't, you are paying emissions levy. So this is one typical example of it. It's added to, compounded to the tax everybody pays at the end of the month. So the core idea is to make emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases more costly, thereby incentivizing businesses and individuals to reduce their emissions and invest in cleaner, more sustainable alternatives. So, as I said, carbon tax is one of them, emissions trading systems or cap trade system, ETS. So what that is that it sets an overall cap on emissions and allocate or sells a limited number of emissions permit to companies. These permits allow the holder to emit specific amounts of CO2. It is similar to the ITMO's international tradable mitigation outcomes. So this is also transnational. A typical example is the collaboration within the Swiss government and Ghana, as well as other Asian countries, where ITMOs are sold by Ghanaian institutions that are providing clean energy and then traded for money or financial grants from the Swedish government. So another one is tax incentives and subsidies, renewable energy certificates, public funding, and research. So these are all measures to contribute to renewable energy policies and all of that. So let's look at case studies of successful mitigation actions by countries around the world. And this is a report by earth.org. It highlights some of the countries that have been doing very well in climate mitigation and climate policy. One of them is Denmark. So Denmark has developed a global action climate strategy, a green and sustainable world. It's essentially to slash emissions and set frameworks for limiting global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius as set by the 2015 Paris Agreement. And from the items that are listed in their document, it tells you that their plans are very strategic and feasible. In essence, they are smart policies that are in place and are looking into the future. These are policies that are achievable and can be done within the possible time frame that has been listed. So these are some of them that they listed in it. Secondly was Sweden. So they set up climate goals, emission reduction targets set by the government with set targets in 2030 to 2045. So these climate goals are set to gradually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then ultimately achieve net zero by 2045. So this is effort by the country itself, right? So they have the Climate Act, they have the Climate Policy Council to ensure that government and parliament is abreast with what is happening globally with regards to climate change and all of those. Right. The third country is Chile, which is in Latin America. So Chile has also put up measures to ensure that they contribute effectively to climate change mitigation. Now, I think I should add up to it that it is not just these particular countries. Every country in the world is bringing up effort, generating activities, policies, development to ensure that they reduce their carbon footprints, to ensure that they don't emit too much carbon dioxide. And I think that though these countries have been doing their best to ensure that they reduce their carbon footprint, it is still not enough. More effort needs to be done, right? It is not just the Western countries or even the developing countries, the small island developing countries and the rest. It is important that everybody contributes to it, especially those in the Western world and those in the global South as well. So concluding, I think that it is important that we all put in an effort to ensure that we are producing a greener and sustainable future. So the pursuit of climate change mitigation takes a collective action. It takes innovation and a steadfast commitment to sustainable practices. You can't do away with climate change mitigation without without the innovation aspect, without a collective action involving women, children, the youth in it. It also takes sustainable practices that do not pollute the environment, sustainable practices that do not release carbon dioxide into the environment. So these are very important components that we must consider in our efforts to promote climate change mitigation. So together we hold the key to fostering a resilient, equitable, and thriving world for generations to come. And it is my earnest expectation that after watching this video, you get motivated enough to also make up your mind that you're also going to reduce your carbon footprint and then contribute in your small, simple way to promote climate change mitigation. Thank you very much. All right, so we've come to Unit 3, Important Industries for Low Carbon Development. This is an add-up to my previous presentation on climate change mitigation, where we looked at strategies for low carbon development. And then this is an add-up to it. Specifically, we are looking at the industries in the world today that are actually producing technology that are low carbon and also contributing to low carbon human activities. So this particular presentation, we looked at climate change, what climate change is, climate change mitigation approaches, that's low carbon development. And then we'll look at the industries that are generating low carbon technologies. So we know what climate change is. Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. And as I indicated earlier on, sometimes it is an over 30-year period, 35-year period, for us to know that this is how the climate of this particular area is. So when there is a shift in that particular average conditions, we know that indeed the climate is changing. And sometimes in some places, these shifts are sudden. I mean, places where they used to have normal rainfall within the period, they knew the patterns of rainfall within the year, and all of a sudden, months that they do not expect rain, they are expecting rains, and not just showers, small showers of it. They are getting flooded by rains. That's to tell you that in essence, there are changes in the atmosphere, there are changes in the climatic patterns. So that is how you're able to change. So that's how we're able to track changes in the climate. So these changes can be natural, that is sun's activities, volcanic eruptions, or can be human-induced through activities like burning of fossil fuel, etc. We all know how human-induced activities contribute to climate change. Driving cars that run on fuel, that is petrol, some of them run on diesels, and then aeroplanes that run on jet fuel, and the rest, some kerosene and the others. The combustion of these fossil fuels release enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Sometimes some of these also generate methane and then nitrous oxide also into it. These particular two gases, methane and especially nitrous oxides, have a higher greenhouse effect than even carbon dioxide themselves. So these are ways that human activities are contributing to release of greenhouse gases, which are affecting climate change. We have agricultural activities like rice farms and the rest. These produce a lot of methane gas into the atmosphere. Now, considering the natural causes like the sun's activities, depending on the distance between the sun and the earth, and if there are changes in the normal activities or operations of the sun's surface, this affects the amount of solar radiation that is released from the sun and the amount that also hits the Earth's surface. And then volcanic eruptions. These volcanic eruptions releases tons of gases into the atmosphere. Now it's a cocktail of different gases, nitrous oxides, acidified gases, and the rest. So combustion of fossil fuels release greenhouse gases like CO2 and CH4. CH4 is what we call methane. These gases are released into the atmosphere when gasoline is combusted in car engines and coals are used to heat buildings, especially in the global north countries where they have the winter seasons within the year. Unlike those in the global south, for instance, in Africa, some part of Africa, West Africa, where we don't have the winter seasons, we don't depend on mostly coals for heating our buildings. And then agricultural practices such as the use of chemical fertilizers is also a major source of methane into the atmosphere. So what does these gases do? What do the greenhouse gases do? So these gases envelop the earth and act like a blanket wrapped around it and traps the sun's heat from escaping through the earth's atmosphere. And this is what we call greenhouse effect. Greenhouse effect is like a blanket into the atmosphere. When the gases want to escape, it just traps it and releases it back down into the atmosphere. So the Earth's atmosphere, this results in the warming of the Earth's surface, known as global warming. It is global because everywhere in the world, everybody is feeling it, and it's manifested in different things. For instance, it manifests in flooding, it manifests in droughts, it manifests in desertification, loss of biodiversity, and the rest. So the impact of these greenhouse gases is not in situ. It affects every part of the globe. But how it affects every part is not the same. People are impacted higher than others. So we looked at climate change mitigation in the previous presentation where we said that it is reducing the flow of heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere. What that means is that we are trying to prevent the release of greenhouse gases, which are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and the rest. We are preventing the release of those ones into the atmosphere, and at the same time generating sinks that are able to absorb these particular greenhouse gases. One of those things is like direct air capture, DAC technology. And then some of these preventive actions are solar PV cells, nuclear energy, and the rest. I'll talk about that as we progress in this presentation. So let's look at climate change mitigation approaches, low carbon development. We've looked at this. So low carbon development is a new pattern of development that aims to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and as much as possible while not affecting increase of economic activity. So what it's doing is that we are preventing the release of greenhouse gases. And at the same time, we don't prevent economic activities. I use an example of a taxi driver who uses a car that runs on fossil fuels, assuming that he starts using a Tesla car for his taxi services. In essence, because the Tesla car is EV, he has cut down significantly on his carbon footprint, the amount of carbon dioxide released and greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere. He has cut down drastically on that. And at the same time, his economic activity, which is conveying people from one place to another, is not cut. So in essence, carbon emissions or greenhouse emissions stop, but economic activity still continues to thrive. This is what low carbon development is all about. So let's look at key industries for low carbon development. Let us begin with the energy sector. So in the energy sector, we have solar energy. So solar energy systems does not produce any emissions during energy generation itself. Now, it should know that in the operationalization stages of this particular technology, it doesn't generate any significant amount of carbon dioxide, but maybe in its manufacturing stage, in its raw material state, they sort of, before manufacturing them, there is emission of greenhouse gases, but in the operational stages, they do not actually produce a lot of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. So solar energy technology constitutes the fastest growing energy source globally, especially in Africa here, where people are now venturing more and more into solar technology. It has gained a stronger foothold on the continent. So examples of solar technology include photovoltaics, that is PVs, photovoltaic cells, concentrating solar power, CSPs, solar thermal energy. I will explain all of this as we progress. So photovoltaic cells or PVCs. So well-known and is the most well-known and fastest growing sector of solar energy technology. As I was saying earlier on, especially in the case of Africa, where more people are relying on solar PV cells to generate clean and reliable energy at their homes. This is because the African continent is big, and sometimes most of the African countries' energy generation is from water sources, which is dams, and not everybody have these huge water rivers and stuff to dam them to generate electricity. And so the solar PV cells, as shown in this particular picture, is a very good example of ways of getting cleaner energy whilst at the same time preventing the emission of carbon dioxide. So the global photovoltaic sector has been growing at an average of over 40% in the last 8 years. So in the last 8 years, the number of people who are actually relying on these solar PV cells has increased by over 40%. And future outlooks projects that this number is going to significantly increase in the coming years and months. So PV, solar photovoltaic devices generate electricity directly from sunlight via an electric process that occurs naturally in certain types of materials. The life cycle carbon dioxide emissions for PVs are now in the range of 25 to 32 watts per kilowatt, sorry, grams per kilowatt hour of energy generation. So as compared to coal-fired power plant with carbon capture and storage of 200, 200. So in essence, the solar PV source actually is a more sustainable option as compared to the conventional ones of conventional technologies like coal-fired power plants or even the hydroelectric dams and then the rest. Another technology within the solar and energy system is the solar concentrating solar power, CSPs. So CSP plants are utility scale generators that produce electricity by using mirrors or lenses to effectively concentrate the sun's energy. I will show you a sample of it in a bit. So there are two main types of this technology, that is parabolic troughs. So it uses rows of curved mirrors to drive conventional steam turbines. I will explain that also in a bit. So this Stirling engine system. So these are shaped much like large satellite dishes and covered with curved mirrors that heat liquid hydrogen to drive the piston of a Stirling engine. So concentrating solar powers are ideally suited to reduce greenhouse gases and other pollutants without creating other environmental risk or contamination. So a point to know is that 1 megawatt hour of installed solar thermal power capacity results in a saving of 600 kilograms of CO2. That's according to the European Solar Thermal Industry Association. So these are the examples of the two types of the CSP. So the example that we have here, you see this sort of mirrors here. What they do is that they focus the beams from the sun onto this particular receiver. What is that is that it heats the liquid inside, which then powers this particular turbine to generate, it powers this turbine to 10 systems within this generator to generate electricity for human use. Another example is this particular one, but it was in a similar way, but slightly different, where the mirrors here actually reflects the light into this particular section of the tower, which contains hydrogen. And then when it's heated, it expands and passes over a turbine, turning it in a generator to generate electricity. So solar thermal systems. So on average, water heating accounts for around 30% of global household CO2 emissions. So solar water heater households CO2 emissions reduce households' total CO2 emissions by 20%. And this is found in most places, especially in Africa here. It is gaining strongholds. People are now venturing into it to fix it onto their rooftops for heating their water systems at home. So solar thermal systems provide an environmentally friendly heating source of household water and space heating. So it works using simple collectors, usually placed on the roof of a house or building. So what it does is that it absorbs the sun's energy and transfers the heat into the water systems, which gets it heated and can be used at home. So installed solar thermal capacity reduces CO2 emissions by approximately 30 million tons each year. That is according to the International Energy Association. It reduces CO2 emissions by 30 million tons each year, instead of relying on fossil fuel related heat sources like gas stoves and then the rest at home, or even burning coal at home and all of that. This serves as a sustainable and reliable source of heating for anyone who actually wants to heat water at home. So let's now move to wind energy. We looked at the solar energy and those that are under it. Let's look at wind energy. So wind energy first developed in Denmark, in terms of for electricity generation, where horizontal axis wind turbines were built in 1891, and a 22.8 meter wind turbine began operation in 1897. So wind energy captures the kinetic energy of air masses by using large wind turbines located on land, onshore, or in sea or freshwater. So this is a typical example of a wind energy. What happens is that these aerodynamic blades on the turbines, when the wind passes over it, it causes it to turn. So what it does is that it also turns a shaft within it, which what do you call it, moves within a generator to generate electricity. Now, this electricity is then transmitted to stations where they are then managed effectively before being sent into homes. So the moving air rotates a wind turbine which rotates rotor blades, subsequently converting the kinetic energy to rotational energy. So a shaft converts the rotational energy into a generator which in turn generates electricity. So this is the rationale behind the operation of the wind turbines. So onshore wind capacity grew from 178 gigawatts in 2010 to 699 gigawatts in 2020. That is globally. So onshore has to do with land, and then offshore has to do with those in the sea. So offshore wind capacity grew from 3.1 gigawatts in 2010 to 34.4 gigawatts in 2020. That made one of the reasons in the slower development with that of the offshore is due to a lot of parameters, the ocean waves, and then there are also several parameters in the ocean surface. The ocean bottom, the bottom of the ocean, which may not be much suitable for the construction of this particular technology. But as time progresses, new ones are being generated that are better suited to such environment. So we expect that in the coming years, we hope that there will be generation of higher amount of energy from these particular sources. Let's look at hydroelectric energy. It is one of the oldest and biggest source of renewable energy, and especially countries in Africa, China, the US, the United States, Asia rely heavily on hydroelectric energy. So it works by utilizing the natural flow of moving water. An example is what we have here, and this is a schematic of it. There's a typical example of a hydroelectric energy. A hydroelectric dam. So the turbines convert the potential energy of fast-falling, flowing water into a mechanical energy. So it utilizes the energy of running water without reducing its quantity to produce electricity. So globally, hydroelectricity prevents the emission of greenhouse gases corresponding to the burning of 4.4 million barrels of petroleum per day worldwide. This is juxtaposing it against fossil-powered power plants that generate electricity, right? So it's in a way, it is a very, very sustainable form of energy generation as compared to those that rely on fossil fuels. So we have other renewable energy sources. We have ocean energy, we have geothermal energy, we have bioenergy as well. So ocean energy has to do with capturing the flow of the water waves and moving mechanical parts to generate electricity, just like how wind rotate the turbines of a wind turbine to generate electricity. In the ocean energy, it also works in that way. It's, what do you call it? It causes mechanical part of the generation system to move, which powers turbines to also generate electricity. We have geothermal energy sources where in some cases, water is pumped deep into the Earth's mantle where there is a lot of heat, and then the vapor that comes out of it is channeled through a turbine. When it powers the turbine also moves in a generator to generate electricity. Then we also have bioenergy. For instance, scientists have come up with a more effective way of relying on plants and other processes for generating electricity, those that have a low carbon signature. So let's move to the transportation sector. So globally, transportation sector accounts for 23% of carbon emission. That was according to PAITAL 2023. So the burning of fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel from engines produces greenhouse gases like CO2 into the atmosphere. So the accumulation of CO2 and other greenhouse gases like methane, nitrous oxide, and hydrofluorocarbons has contributed to the rising temperature of the Earth's atmosphere, consequently resulting in climate change. Now, the schematic here shows the climate impact of how the climate impact of different means of transportation by humans. And we know that by air, there is about 130.2 grams per kilometer of CO2 emissions. We also followed by passenger cars, motorbikes, buses, and buses are for carpooling. We have rails, the maritime, and then the other stuff as well. So in the transportation sector, the low carbon development technologies that are churning out, and one of them is the electric vehicles, the EVs. It is estimated that if the sales of EVs increase by 1% in a city, it can reduce CO2 emissions locally by 0.096% and by 0.0087% in a nearby city. So electric cars emit approximately 17 to 30% less carbon than gasoline or diesel cars, right? So these are some of the things, the advantages of going in for EV, what do you call it, cars, electric vehicles. So the total number of electric vehicles is expected to reach a staggering 145 million by the year 2030, in a way to help us reduce our carbon footprint as a species on the planet. So this is a schematic showing the types of fuels and the contribution of the different types of electric vehicles to carbon climate change mitigation and carbon dioxide reduction globally. So public transportation and alternative fuels. So shifting from cars to public transportation can reduce up to 2.2 tons of carbon emissions annually per individual. That's according to the United Nations. So carpooling can result in up to 1 tons of carbon emissions reduced per person per year. And this is quite significant considering the number of people that are sometimes clustered in particular cities. Cities like those found in China, Hong Kong, and the rest, Mumbai, and those that have a lot of people living in New York City and the rest. If we all carpool or use this kind of vehicles, I think we can all reduce our carbon footprint. So the alternative fuel, going back to the bioenergy here, some of these are the propane, the natural gases, the electric hybrids, and hydrogen fuels, as well as biodiesels. So let's look at the agriculture and land use sector. So before we go to the low carbon technologies, let's look at the impact of agriculture and land use on carbon emissions. In 2018 alone, global greenhouse gases emissions due to agriculture was 9.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. That's according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. So in the same year, methane and nitrous oxides from crops and livestock activities released over 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalents, representing 40% increase since the year 2000. And in Africa alone, both farm gate and land use related emissions increased over the entire 2000 to 2018 period by 38% and 20% respectively. So this tells you the contribution of agriculture and land use change to greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural activities like rice farming has been studied to discover that it is one of the major contributors of methane into the atmosphere. So let's look at sustainable agricultural practices to reduce carbon emissions. Yes, so conservation tillage, cutting down on nitrogen fertilizer applied to crops, that is using green technology, green farming, and organic farming, if you may put it, as a panacea to it. Changing manure and livestock management practices. How manure, if we reuse manure to generate or compost, instead of dumping them into the environment, it is one of the ways. Planting more trees or grasses, that's agroforestry. Planting trees in the farms and all of that. Installation of wind turbines or solar panels as sources of energies on farms. In a way, that is sort of a green method of producing farm produce. All right. So concluding on that, so climate change is upon us all, and we are all impacted by climate change regardless of our financial status or nationality. It doesn't matter if you are in the developed world or you are in the developing world, or even if you're in a small island developing state, we are all impacted by climate change. And the efforts to produce a low carbon future and reaching net zero depends on all of us, and we cannot compromise on it. However, this net zero future cannot be achieved without a concerted effort from everyone across the globe. So we must all come together to combine our efforts and voices to achieve our common goal of providing a sustainable future for posterity. I believe that this presentation has been very insightful to you, and that if you have any questions, kindly reach out to me via email podangquatin@gmail.com. It is at the cover page of this particular presentation. I wish you all the best in your endeavors in your fight for low carbon development technologies in the future.